Tonight, we'll take you on another quiet journey through time, into one of history's more brutal chapters, told gently so your mind can rest while the past unfolds. Your conception wasn't exactly a romantic comedy. Picture Mount Olympus, sometime in the Bronze Age, where the gods were throwing what might generously be called a wedding reception. The bride was your mother, Thetis, a sea goddess with the temperament of a hurricane and the beauty of moonlight on water. The groom? Your father, Peleus, a mortal king who somehow convinced a divine being to settle down with a mere human. Already we can see where your story was heading, can't we? Now, your mother wasn't exactly thrilled about this arrangement. She'd been perfectly content ruling the waves, thank you very much. But Zeus himself had orchestrated this match, not out of romantic sentiment, mind you, but because of a rather inconvenient prophecy. You see, it had been foretold that Thetis would bear a son greater than his father. When you're Zeus, the last thing you want is competition from your own potential offspring. So naturally he married her off to a mortal. Problem solved, or so he thought. She tossed it into the crowd of goddesses and watched the drama unfold. But that golden apple would eventually roll its way into the judgment of Paris, which would lead to a certain prince stealing a certain queen, which would lead to the war you're destined for. Divine wedding gifts have a way of creating consequences decades later. What matters for you, dear Achilles, is that your parents' union was already cursed with divine interference, political maneuvering, and the kind of family drama that would make modern soap operas seem quaint. 9 months later you arrived, beautiful, half divine, and already carrying the weight of prophecy on your impossibly tiny shoulders. The oracle had spoken, as oracles annoyingly tend to do, delivering news that would haunt your entire existence. You would live a short life, but a glorious one. Fame or longevity? Pick one, the universe seemed to say. No pressure, little baby. Your mother, Thetis, heard this prophecy and did what any reasonable divine being would do when faced with cosmic inevitability. She decided to cheat, because obviously a sea goddess could outwit the fates themselves. Obviously. Her plan was brilliantly simple, in the way that brilliant plans often are before they spectacularly backfire. She would make you invulnerable. Not just tough, not just resilient, completely, utterly, impossibly invulnerable. Her method? A little dip in the river Styx, the boundary between earth and the underworld, whose waters could grant immortality to the living. Picture this scene. Your mother cradling your infant form, standing at the banks of the most feared river in existence. The Styx flows black as night, cold as death, and carries the binding power of the gods themselves. Even Zeus fears to break an oath sworn on its waters. Into this river your mother lowered you, her precious baby, holding you by your tiny heel. The transformation was immediate and almost complete. Your skin became harder than bronze, your bones stronger than iron. Swords would shatter against your flesh, arrows would bounce off like pebbles. You became a walking impossibility, a mortal who could not be killed. Almost. You see, your mother had to hold you by something, didn't she? And the spot where her fingers gripped your heel remained untouched by the Styx's waters. One tiny, vulnerable patch of mortal flesh on an otherwise divine body. The irony was already writing itself into your story. Thetis, for all her divine wisdom, had created a walking contradiction. You were simultaneously the most protected and most doomed baby in existence. Your invulnerability would make you legendary, but that one exposed heel remained as a reminder that even divine protection has its limits. The very spot she used to save you carried the weight of imperfection in an otherwise perfect defense. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You're still just a baby at this point, blissfully unaware that your mother's love had just guaranteed your doom in the most roundabout way possible. She held you close, believing she'd cheated destiny itself. The water of the Styx dripped from your skin like liquid starlight, and your eyes already held a brightness that seemed too intense for a mortal child. Your father, Peleus, watched from the riverbank with the expression of a man who'd married above his station and was still figuring out what that meant. Divine wives, it turned out, came with divine problems. Who knew? In the days that followed your river baptism, it became clear that the Styx had done its work. You were unnaturally strong, even for a baby. Your grip could bend bronze, your cries could shatter pottery. When you fell, and babies fall constantly, you bounced instead of breaking. Servants dropped you exactly once before learning to be more careful with the invulnerable infant. Your parents tried to maintain some semblance of normal family life, which was adorable in its futility. How do you raise a half-divine child with anger management issues and an immunity to physical harm? Very carefully, as it turned out. Your childhood tantrums weren't just loud, they were structurally damaging. By your first birthday, you'd already outgrown most of your toys by accidentally destroying them. Wooden horses became splinters, bronze swords became twisted metal art, and your nursemaids developed the nervous expressions of people constantly expecting disaster. The prophecy hung over your cradle like a particularly ominous mobile. Short life, glorious death. Your mother tried to pretend she hadn't heard it, your father tried to pretend it didn't matter, and you remained blissfully unaware that your entire existence was essentially a countdown timer. Other children your age were learning to walk and speak their first words. You were learning to moderate your strength so you didn't accidentally crush everything you touched. Your first word wasn't mama or dada, it was careful, which should tell you everything about your early childhood environment. The palace staff developed an elaborate system of childproofing that would have impressed modern safety experts. Furniture was reinforced, walls were padded, and everyone learned to move very quickly when they heard the patter of your impossibly strong little feet. But here's the thing about prophecies. They're not really about the ending, they're about the journey. And your journey was just beginning, with a mother determined to protect you from a fate she'd accidentally made inevitable, and a father trying to raise a weapon disguised as his son. Thus began your legend, dear Achilles, with the best of intentions, the worst of outcomes, and a heel that would become the most famous weak spot in history. Because nothing says Greek tragedy like a loving mother whose protective instincts create the one flaw in an otherwise perfect plan. By the time you could walk, or rather, by the time you could walk without accidentally putting your feet through the floor, your parents realized they had a problem. You weren't just strong, you were growing stronger every day. More concerning, you were growing bored. And a bored, invulnerable toddler with superhuman strength is basically a natural disaster waiting to happen. Your father's palace was showing the strain. Doors hung crooked on their hinges, training dummies lay in splinters, and the royal furniture looked like it had survived a siege. Which, in a way, it had, a siege conducted by one small boy who didn't know his own strength. Your parents held what could generously be called a family meeting, by which we mean your mother paced around the throne room like a caged storm, while your father sat very still and tried not to say anything that might set her off. The topic: what to do with their increasingly destructive miracle child. Needs proper training, Thetis declared, gesturing at the latest casualty. A bronze shield you'd bent into an abstract sculpture during what you'd called playing. He needs someone who understands strength, who can teach him control. Peleus nodded along, because when your wife is a sea goddess discussing your half-divine son's education, agreement is really your only safe option. What did you have in mind? Your mother's answer would change your life forever. Chiron. Now, let's talk about Chiron for a moment. He was what happened when the gods decided that immortal, wise centaurs made excellent educators. Unlike his wild, wine-loving centaur brethren, Chiron was civilized, learned, and possessed of the kind of patience required to teach young heroes without eating them. He had already trained Jason, Asclepius, and a dozen other legendary figures. His cave on Mount Pelion had become the ancient world's most exclusive boarding school. The decision made, you were packed off to your new tutor before you'd even turned 3. Your luggage was minimal. When you're invulnerable, you don't need much in the way of protective gear. Just some clothes, some toys, the few that had survived, and a letter from your mother explaining your unique needs. Your first glimpse of Chiron must have been quite something. Picture a creature with the torso of a bearded man and the body of a magnificent horse, standing outside a cave that somehow managed to look both rustic and scholarly. Scrolls lined the walls alongside weapons, and the scent of medicinal herbs mixed with the metallic tang of well-maintained armor. Chiron looked down at you, all 3 feet of barely contained divine energy, and smiled. So, he said in a voice like distant thunder. "You're the boy who bends bronze." Your education began immediately because Chiron wasn't one for gentle transitions. On your first day, he handed you a spear. Not a child-sized training spear, a real one, sharp enough to kill. "Let's see what you can do," he said. You threw it. It flew so hard and fast that it embedded itself 3 feet deep in a solid oak tree. Chiron nodded, approvingly. "Good. Now we work on accuracy." What followed were years that can only be described as the most intense childhood education in human history. Chiron taught you everything: how to hunt, how to fight, how to track, how to heal. But more importantly, he taught you how to control yourself, how to move through the world without breaking it. Your daily routine would have killed a normal child. Dawn brought spear practice, followed by sword play, followed by wrestling with creatures that would give grown men nightmares. Afternoons were for learning the healing arts, how to set bones, treat wounds, identify medicinal plants. Evenings were reserved for music and poetry, because apparently even legendary warriors needed cultural enrichment. The music lessons were interesting. Your first lyre lasted exactly 1 song before your enthusiasm reduced it to kindling and twisted strings. Chiron, with the patience of someone who'd literally seen everything, simply handed you another one. Gentler, he advised. Music is about subtlety. It took 17 lyres before you managed to play a complete song without destroying your instrument. Chiron collected the wreckage without comment, though you suspected he was keeping count. The hunting lessons were more successful, mostly because the local wildlife provided moving targets that couldn't break. You learned to track deer through morning mist, to move silently through dense forest, to anticipate your prey's movements. Your strength meant that when you caught something, it stayed caught. Your speed meant that very little escaped you. But the most important lessons were the ones Chiron never explicitly taught. Lessons about solitude, about the weight of being different, about the responsibility that comes with power. You were the only student in his cave, the only child who could bend bronze and outrun horses. The loneliness of being exceptional began early. Chiron understood this in ways your parents couldn't. He'd spent centuries being the only civilized centaur, watching wild cousins give his entire species a reputation for chaos and violence. He knew what it meant to be alone in your own category. "Strength without wisdom is destruction," he told you one evening as you sat by the fire, your latest lyre intact in your hands. "Wisdom without strength is helplessness. You have the first. My job is to give you the second." Years passed. You grew, from a destructive toddler into a dangerous child, then into something that was no longer quite either. Your body developed the impossible proportions of heroic statuary. Tall, broad-shouldered, with arms that looked carved from marble. Your face took on the kind of beauty that made people stop talking when you entered a room. But it was your eyes that really marked you as different. They held an intensity that seemed to burn from within, a focus that could be unsettling to those who didn't know you. Chiron called it the look of someone who's seen his own ending. You were still a child, but you carried yourself like someone who'd already accepted his fate. The other lessons continued. You learned anatomy by practicing on the wild boars that roamed Mount Pelion. You learned strategy by hunting pack animals. You learned medicine by treating your own minor injuries, the few that could actually hurt you. Your fighting style developed into something uniquely yours. Most warriors relied on armor and shields for protection. You relied on speed and the knowledge that very little could actually harm you. Your technique became aggressive, reckless, beautiful in its complete lack of defensive concerns. Why guard when you can attack? Why retreat when you can advance? Chiron watched your development with the satisfaction of a master craftsman. You weren't just learning to fight. You were becoming a weapon. A thinking, feeling, incredibly dangerous weapon who could compose poetry and treat battle wounds with equal skill. By your 10th year on Mount Pelion, you'd outgrown most of what Chiron could teach you about combat. You could hit a target at 100 paces, bring down a charging boar with your bare hands, and move through forest undergrowth without disturbing a single leaf. You'd become something magnificent and terrible. But you were also becoming restless. The mountain felt small, the daily routines felt repetitive. You'd begun staring out from the cave mouth toward the distant sea, toward the world beyond your education. Chiron recognized the signs. You were ready to leave, whether he was ready to let you go or not. Your last night on Mount Pelion, Chiron gave you a gift, a sword of his own making, forged from meteoric iron and tempered in the waters of 7 sacred springs. It was perfectly balanced, impossibly sharp, and sized exactly for your grip. "Every hero needs a proper blade," he said, watching you test its weight. "This one will serve you well in the times that are coming." You wanted to ask what times he meant, but something in his expression stopped you. Chiron had always been honest with you about everything except your future. Some truths, his silence suggested, were burdens you'd have to carry when you were ready. You left Mount Pelion the next morning, no longer the destructive child who'd arrived years before. You were something new, a perfectly trained weapon, with the soul of a poet and the face of a god. Chiron watched you go with the expression of someone who'd done his job perhaps too well. The mountains seemed smaller behind you with every step, until it was just another peak in the distance. Ahead lay the world, waiting to discover what 13 years of Centaur education had created. Behind you, Chiron settled back into his cave, already dreading the stories he'd soon hear about his most successful and most dangerous student. Because nothing says I've successfully educated a hero like knowing you've just released something magnificent and unstoppable into a world that isn't ready for either quality. Returning home after 13 years of Centaur education was like putting on clothes that no longer fit. Your father's palace felt cramped, the servants seemed fragile, and every conversation felt stilted around the edges of what nobody wanted to discuss, the prophecy that still hung over your head like a sword. Your mother, Thetis, watched you with the expression of someone who'd sent away a destructive child and gotten back a living weapon. You moved differently now, with the fluid grace of a natural predator, every gesture economical and purposeful. When you spoke, people listened. When you entered a room, conversations stopped. You'd become exactly what Chiron had intended, a perfect hero. Which was, unfortunately, exactly the problem. News travelled fast in the Bronze Age, especially news about impossibly beautiful young warriors who could bend bronze and move like lightning. Stories about you began spreading across the Greek world before you'd even been home a month. Every bard had a new verse about the son of Thetis. Every merchant had heard tales of your incredible strength. Fame, it seemed, was hunting you down whether you wanted it or not. Then came the news that would change everything. Paris had stolen Helen from Sparta. The Greek kings were gathering their armies, calling in ancient oaths and settling old scores. They were going to war, and they were looking for heroes to fill their ranks. Your mother heard the news and went absolutely pale. Not the normal human pale of someone who's received bad news, but the otherworldly pale of a sea goddess watching prophecy arrange itself into inevitability. "No," she said, which is what divine mothers always say when fate comes knocking. Absolutely not. But you were already interested. War meant glory, and glory was what you'd been trained for. The stories of this coming conflict were already epic in scope. 1,000 ships, the most beautiful woman in the world, a siege that would echo through eternity. It was exactly the kind of war that could make a hero legendary. Your mother saw the look in your eyes and recognized it immediately, the same expression you'd worn as a child when you'd spotted something interesting to break. Except now, instead of furniture, you were looking at your own destiny. "The prophecy," she reminded you, as if you could have forgotten. "Short life, glorious death. Going to Troy is exactly what the fates want you to do." You shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who'd spent 13 years accepting the inevitable. "Maybe. Or maybe I can have the glory without the death." Thetis stared at you with the expression of someone who'd just realized her son had inherited her stubborn streak along with her divine blood. This was going to require drastic measures. Her solution was brilliantly simple, in the way that brilliant solutions often are before they become catastrophically complicated. If the Greeks were looking for Achilles the warrior, then Achilles the warrior would simply have to disappear. In his place would be someone else entirely. "We're going to Syros," she announced. Tyros was perfect for what she had in mind. a small island kingdom ruled by King Lycomedes, far enough from the mainland to avoid unwanted attention. More importantly, Lycomedes had daughters. Many daughters. What was one more young woman among so many? You stared at your mother with the expression of someone who just realized that divine wisdom sometimes took very unexpected forms. "You want me to what?" "Heed among the princess," she said, as if this were the most reasonable suggestion in the world. Who would look for the great warrior Achilles among King Lycomedes' daughters? The answer, of course, was anyone with functioning eyes, but your mother was operating under the assumption that people see what they expect to see. If you were dressed as a woman, living among women, then clearly you must be a woman. Logic, divine style. The transformation took weeks. First came the clothing, chitons in soft pastels, jewelry that caught the light, sandals that looked decorative rather than practical. Then came the more challenging parts, learning to walk differently, to speak more softly, to arrange your expression into something less intensely focused. Your mother hired tutors for feminine arts, weaving, dancing, the kind of conversation that flitted like butterflies from topic to topic. You approached these lessons with the same methodical intensity you'd brought to spear throwing, which was probably your first mistake. "Gentler," your weaving instructor pleaded as you snapped another loom through sheer enthusiasm. "Weaving is a delicate art." "So is war," you replied, which wasn't exactly the kind of comment that supported your disguise. But gradually you began to adapt. Your voice, naturally deep, learned to speak in a higher register. Your movements, trained for combat efficiency, softened into something more graceful. You learned to arrange your face into expressions of interest rather than calculation, to laugh at things that weren't particularly funny, to discuss topics that held no strategic value whatsoever. The hardest part was the hair. Your mother insisted on elaborate braids and arrangements that took hours to create and felt like wearing a helmet made of vanity, but you endured it, because the alternative was explaining to a gathering Greek army why you weren't interested in their war. When the transformation was complete, even you had to admit it was impressive. The face looking back from the bronze mirror was undeniably feminine, beautiful in a softer way than your natural masculine beauty, but recognizably female to any casual observer. You looked like exactly what you were pretending to be, a lovely young princess with no warrior training whatsoever. Your mother was satisfied. "Perfect," she declared. "Now we go to Skyros, and you become Pyrrha, one of King Lycomedes' many daughters. You'll be safe there until this war madness passes." The journey to Skyros was your first test of the disguise. Traveling as a young noblewoman required different skills than traveling as yourself. You had to accept help with things you could easily do alone, to seem delicate when you were anything but, to appear interested in conversations about fashion and gossip when you'd rather discuss military strategy. But you managed it. By the time you reached Skyros, you'd settled into the role well enough to fool the king himself. Lycomedes welcomed you as a distant cousin, sent for protection during troubled times, a common enough arrangement among royal families. His daughters accepted you with the easy warmth of young women gaining another sister. They taught you their particular version of palace life, which servants could be trusted with secrets, which courtiers were worth impressing, where the best spots were for private conversations. You learned to participate in their world while maintaining your secret. You attended their lessons in music and poetry, joined their walks through the palace gardens, listened to their discussions about marriage prospects and political alliances. It was like learning an entirely new language, one spoken in glances and implications rather than direct statements. The irony wasn't lost on Rue. You'd spent 13 years learning to be a perfect warrior, and now you were spending months learning to be a perfect princess. Both, it turned out, required their own forms of discipline and dedication. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months. You developed a routine, a persona, a place in the small world of Skyros Palace. The other princesses considered you slightly odd. You ate more than seemed possible for someone your size. You sometimes forgot to giggle at appropriate moments, and you had an unsettling tendency to know things about weapons. But they attributed your quirks to your foreign upbringing. You told yourself you were just waiting for the war fever to pass, waiting for your mother's fears to prove unfounded, waiting for a time when you could return to being yourself. But as the months stretched on, you began to wonder if this might be your life now, an eternal masquerade, playing a role that kept you safe and bored in equal measure. The disguise was working perfectly, too perfectly perhaps, because when something seems too good to be true, fate has a way of introducing complications. And your particular complication was about to arrive in the form of a princess with dark eyes and a smile that made you forget, just for a moment, that you were supposed to be someone else entirely. Nothing says flawless plan like falling in love while dressed as someone you're not. Her name was Diademia, and she was everything your disguise wasn't. Genuinely feminine, naturally graceful, and completely unaware that one of her sisters was actually a legendary warrior in an elaborate dress. She had the kind of beauty that seemed effortless, dark hair that caught sunlight like silk, and a laugh that made you remember why poets wrote verses about women. You noticed her immediately, which should have been your first warning. When you're supposed to be hiding among the princesses, developing an intense interest in one of them rather defeats the purpose of the disguise. But, logic it turned out, was no match for whatever was happening when she looked at you. Diademia was King Lycomedes' favourite daughter, which meant she had freedoms the others didn't. She could walk unescorted through the palace gardens, speak her mind in court, and choose her own companions. Naturally, she chose you. "There's something different about you, Pyrrha," she said one afternoon as you walked along the cliffs overlooking the sea. She used your false name easily, but her eyes held a curiosity that made you uncomfortable. "You're not like the other court ladies." You tried to deflect with humour. "I eat more than them?" She laughed, but didn't let the subject drop. "It's more than that. You move like, I don't know, like you're always ready for something. And you know things." "What kind of things?" "Yesterday, when the guards were discussing military tactics, you corrected them. Under your breath, but I heard you. How does a princess know about battlefield formations?" This was dangerous territory. Your cover story explained away many things, but not a comprehensive knowledge of warfare. You searched for an acceptable explanation and settled on partial truth. "My father had me educated alongside my brothers. He believed daughters should understand the world they'd be ruling." It was plausible enough, and Diademia seemed to accept it. But her curiosity didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. She began seeking out your company more often, asking questions about your homeland, your family, your opinions on everything from poetry to politics. The attention was flattering and terrifying in equal measure. You found yourself looking forward to her conversations, enjoying her wit, appreciating the way she listened when you spoke, but every moment together was also a moment when your disguise might slip, when some gesture or comment might reveal what you really were. The turning point came during a festival of Artemis. The entire court had gathered to celebrate the hunt goddess, and the evening's entertainment included dancing and music that continued well into the night. You'd been successfully avoiding the dancing. Your movement training was distinctly unprincess-like, but Diademia wasn't accepting excuses. "Still dance," she insisted, taking your hand. "I promise not to judge your technique." The music was slow, romantic, entirely inappropriate for what you were supposed to be, but her hand was warm in yours, and she was looking at you with an expression that made your carefully constructed persona feel like a prison. For the first time in months, you wanted to tell someone the truth. Instead, you danced, and tried not to think about how perfectly she fit in your arms, or how her presence made you forget about prophecies and wars, and the careful balance of your deception. That night, walking back to your chambers, she stopped you in a corridor lit only by moonlight through tall windows. "Pyrrha," she said, and something in her voice made you turn. "I know you're keeping secrets." Your heart stopped. This was it. Discovery. Failure. The end of your mother's elaborate plan. You prepared explanations, denials, whatever story might preserve your cover. But before you could speak, she stepped closer. "I don't care what they are." And then she kissed you. The kiss was soft, tentative, nothing like the aggressive certainty you brought to everything else in your life, but it was also honest in a way that your entire existence on Syros hadn't been. For a moment you forgot about your disguise, your prophecy, your carefully hidden identity. You were just someone kissing someone else under moonlight, and it felt more real than anything had in months. When she pulled away, her eyes held questions you couldn't answer without destroying everything. But they also held something else, a warmth that suggested she might not need all the answers immediately. "Your chambers or mine?" she asked, with a directness that reminded you why you'd been drawn to her in the first place. What followed was the most complicated seduction in mythological history. You had to maintain your feminine disguise while revealing enough of your true nature to make the encounter possible. It required creativity, patience, and a level of deception that would have impressed Odysseus. Deidamia, to her credit, adapted to each revelation with the flexibility of someone who'd suspected all along that you weren't quite what you appeared to be. When she discovered the true nature of what lay beneath your feminine clothing, she showed surprise but not shock, curiosity but not fear. "So," she said afterward, lying in your arms as dawnlight crept through the window shutters, "what's your real name?" You hesitated. Giving her your true name would make this real in ways that frightened you, but lying to her now felt impossible. "Achilles," you whispered. She was quiet for so long you thought she might have fallen asleep. Then, "The son of Thetis, the one they're calling the greatest warrior of his generation." "That's what they say. And you're hiding here dressed as a woman because there's a war coming, and my mother thinks it will kill me." Deidamia turned in your arms to look at you directly. In the growing light, her face was serious, but not afraid. "Will it?" "Probably." "Then we'd better make the most of the time we have." What began as a single night became a pattern. You'd spend your days maintaining your disguise, participating in the daily life of the palace, playing the role of Princess Pyrrha. But your nights belonged to Deidamia, to honesty and intimacy, and the dangerous luxury of being yourself with someone who accepted all of it. She never asked you to abandon your disguise or reveal yourself to others. She understood that your safety, and hers, depended on the continuation of the deception. But in private, she called you by your real name and treated you as what you were, a warrior in hiding, a hero postponing his destiny. The weeks passed in a strange double life. By day you wove and gossiped and pretended interest in courtly romance. By night, you shared Deidamia's bed and her secrets, telling her stories of your training with Chiron, your divine mother's fears, the prophecy that shadowed your future. She told you about her own life, the pressures of being a king's daughter, the marriage alliances being discussed without her input, her dreams of a world larger than Syros. You were both, in your own ways, trapped by expectations and birthright. Then came the morning when everything changed. Deidamia woke before you, which was unusual. Your warrior's training made you naturally alert to dawn. But this morning you slept deeply, exhausted by dreams that felt more like prophecies. You woke to find her sitting by the window, still naked, staring out at the sea with an expression you'd never seen before. "Deidamia?" You sat up, immediately alert to the change in her mood. She turned to you with a smile that held equal parts joy and terror. "I'm pregnant." The words hit you like a physical blow. Pregnant, which meant a child, which meant consequences that extended far beyond your carefully maintained disguise. You'd created a life while pretending to be someone else, fathered a child while hiding from your own destiny. "Are you certain?" She nodded. 3 weeks late, and I'm never late. Plus, I've been sick every morning for the past week." She paused, studying your expression. "How do you feel about being a father?" "How did you feel?" Terrified, exhilarated, overwhelmed by the implications. A child meant ties to this place, to this life, to a future that didn't include glory or war or early death. It meant everything your mother had tried to give you by bringing you here. A reason to stay hidden, to remain safe, to let someone else be the hero. It also meant responsibility of a kind you'd never considered, not just to yourself or your destiny, but to another person entirely. Someone who would carry your bloodline, your divine heritage, your complicated legacy. "I feel..." You started, then stopped. The truth was too large for words. "I feel like everything just became much more complicated." Deidamia laughed, and the sound held relief. "Good complicated or bad complicated?" "I don't know yet." But even as you said it, you were already planning. The child would need protection, recognition, a place in the world. You couldn't give him, and somehow you knew it would be a him, your name, openly, but you could ensure his future in other ways. Over the following weeks, as Daedaria's pregnancy progressed, you found yourself imagining a different life. One where you remained on Syros, raised your son, grew old in peaceful obscurity. Your mother's plan succeeding completely, the prophecy cheated through simple domestic happiness. It was a beautiful dream, too beautiful perhaps for someone whose fate had been written in the stars before his birth, because while you were playing house and imagining peaceful futures, the war you were hiding from was growing larger and more desperate. And desperate times, as you were about to learn, call for desperate measures, the kind of measures that don't respect disguises or hideouts or the careful plans of protective mothers. The kind of measures that come looking for heroes whether they want to be found or not. Your son would be born, Neoptolemos, new, war, and the name would prove meaningful in ways you couldn't yet imagine, because nothing says peaceful family life like naming your child after the very thing you're trying to avoid. Nine months passed in the strange, suspended time of waiting. You watched Deidamia's body change, felt the child move beneath your hands when you pressed them to her belly, and tried to convince yourself that this could be your life. A secret family, a hidden identity, a future measured in ordinary years rather than glorious moments. Your son was born on a winter morning when the sea outside Syros was grey as hammered steel. Neoptolemus. The name came to you the moment you held him, as if it had been waiting for this exact child. He was beautiful in the way that babies are when they've inherited the best of their bloodlines, your bone structure, Deidamia's colouring, and an alertness in his eyes that suggested he'd gotten his fair share of divine heritage. Holding him was like holding concentrated possibility. This tiny person carried your blood, your potential, your capacity for both creation and destruction. He was innocent of prophecies and wars, and the weight of legendary expectations. For now, "He looks like you," Deidamia whispered, exhausted, but smiling as she watched you cradle your son. "Poor child," you replied, but you were smiling too. For the first time in your life, you'd created something instead of training to destroy something. It felt significant, in ways you couldn't quite articulate. The weeks that followed were perhaps the happiest of your life. You developed routines around your son's needs, feeding, changing, walking the palace corridors at night when he couldn't sleep. Your disguise became almost secondary to your role as a father. You were still Princess Pyrrha during court functions, but increasingly you were just Achilles in private, a man learning to be gentle with something infinitely fragile. Deidamia recovered quickly from the birth, helped by her natural strength and your stolen knowledge of healing arts. She'd grown even more beautiful during pregnancy, as if creating life had unlocked something radiant within her. Watching her with your son, you understood why men wrote poems about domestic happiness. But happiness, you were learning, had a way of making time pass differently. What felt like a perfect, eternal moment was actually just another season in the larger rhythm of the world. And while you were playing father and discovering the joys of midnight feedings, that world was moving toward a confrontation that would reshape everything. The signs were subtle at first. Ships passed Syros more frequently, carrying news of gathering armies and mounting tensions. King Lycomedes received more messengers, held more private councils, spoke in hushed tones about alliances and obligations. The war you'd been hiding from was growing larger and more desperate. Then came the morning when everything changed. You were in the palace courtyard, bouncing Neoptolemus while he made the happy gurgling sounds that 6-month-old babies use to express contentment with the universe. Deidamia sat nearby, weaving and humming a lullaby that made the domestic scene complete. It was the kind of moment that should have felt permanent. That's when the merchant arrived. He came with a small ship and a smaller crew, announcing himself as a trader from the mainland, looking to offer his wares to the royal household. Nothing unusual in that. Merchants visited regularly, bringing goods from the wider world to Syros' isolated court. But something about this merchant felt different. He was older, grey-bearded, with eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. He moved with a confidence that suggested he was used to being the smartest person in any room he entered. When he smiled, it was the kind of smile that suggested he knew things you didn't. His name, he told King Lycomedes, was Odysseus. You felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. Odysseus of Ithaca was famous throughout the Greek world for his cunning, his silver tongue, and his ability to see through any deception. If anyone could penetrate your disguise, it would be him. But he gave no sign of recognizing you. Instead, he unpacked his wares in the palace's main hall with the theatrical flair of someone who understood that presentation was half of salesmanship. Bolts of fine cloth, jewellery that caught the light, perfumes that carried scents of distant lands, the kind of things that would appeal to a court full of women. The princesses gathered eagerly, as he'd clearly expected they would. You hung back, bouncing Neoptolemus and trying to look appropriately interested in feminine luxuries, while keeping as much distance as possible between yourself and those calculating eyes. Odysseus spread his goods with practiced showmanship, describing the origins of each piece, telling stories of the exotic places he'd visited to acquire them. The princesses clustered around his display like flowers drawn to sunlight, exclaiming over silk scarves and golden bracelets. And for the ladies who appreciate more practical beauty, he said, producing an item that made your blood freeze. It was a sword. Not just any sword, a blade of exceptional quality, its steel bright as winter sunlight, its hilt wrapped in leather that had been polished to perfection. It lay among the perfumes and jewellery like a serpent among flowers, beautiful and completely out of place. This piece, Odysseus continued, is said to have been forged by the Cyclopes themselves. Perfect balance, an edge that never dulls, light enough for a woman's hand, but strong enough to cleave bronze. The other princesses looked at the weapon with polite confusion. It was clearly beautiful, but what would they do with a sword? They murmured appreciatively about its craftsmanship while keeping their distance. But you couldn't look away. The blade called to you with the voice of everything you'd been trained for, everything you'd been denying for months. Your hands itched to feel its weight, to test its balance, to discover how it moved through the air. 13 years of weapons training don't disappear just because you're wearing a dress. Odysseus watched the reactions of his audience with the attention of someone conducting an experiment. His eyes moved from face to face, noting interest, indifference, desire. When his gaze reached you, it lingered. Perhaps one of the ladies would like to examine it more closely, he suggested, his tone casual but his eyes sharp as arrows. The other princesses demurred politely. Swords were men's business after all. They preferred the jewellery, the perfumes, the things that suited their station and training. But you took a step forward. You couldn't help yourself. The blade was magnificent, a weapon worthy of heroes, and your hands moved toward it before your mind could stop them. Years of disguise, months of careful deception, a life built on hiding your true nature, and you were about to destroy it all for the chance to hold a sword. Pyrrha? Deidamia's voice cut through your trance. She was looking at you with concern, noting your expression, your posture, the way you'd moved toward the weapon like iron drawn to a lodestone. You stopped, hand halfway extended, caught between your disguise and your nature. The moment stretched like a bowstring, taut with possibility and danger. Odysseus smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Please," he said, and his voice carried the authority of someone who'd just won a very important game. "Don't let me stop you." You looked at the sword, at Odysseus, at Deidamia holding your son. Everything you'd built here, everything you'd tried to preserve, balanced on the edge of this moment. You could step back, maintain your disguise, continue your hidden life. All you had to do was walk away from the weapon. But you'd been trained by Chiron. You'd spent 13 years learning to be perfect with blade and spear and bow. The sword wasn't just a weapon. It was everything you were, everything you'd been born to be. Denying it felt like denying your own heartbeat. Your hand closed around the hilt. The moment your fingers touched the leather wrapping, your disguise shattered like pottery hitting stone. Your posture changed, your balance shifted, your entire bearing transformed from feminine grace to masculine power. You lifted the blade, tested its weight. moved it through a practice form that was both beautiful and deadly. It was perfect. The weapon sang in your hands, responding to your movements like an extension of your own body. For the first time in months, you felt complete. The hall had gone completely silent. The princesses stared at you with expressions ranging from shock to dawning understanding. King Lycomedes looked like someone who'd just realized his guest was actually a wolf in sheep's clothing. Didamia's face showed no surprise, only a sadness that suggested she'd known this moment would come eventually. "Magnificent," Odysseus said, and his voice held genuine appreciation. "I've rarely seen anyone handle a blade with such natural grace. You must be the Achilles I've heard so much about." "Game over. Your disguise lay in ruins around your feet, destroyed by your own inability to resist your nature. All those months of careful deception, undone by the sight of a sword." You looked at Odysseus with the expression of someone who'd just been outmaneuvered by a master. "How long have you known?" "From the moment I arrived," he admitted with a grin that held no malice, only satisfaction at a job well done. "Your mother is skilled at many things, but disguising a legendary warrior isn't one of them. You move like someone who's been trained to kill since childhood. You eat like someone who burns energy in combat training. And you've been staring at my ship since I arrived, calculating its defenses." He gestured toward the sword still in your hands. "But I wanted to be certain, so I set a little trap. Present a room full of women with jewelry and perfume and one perfect weapon, and see who reaches for what." The results were illuminating. You set the sword down carefully, not trusting yourself to keep holding it. The weight of what had just happened was settling over you like armor. Your secret was exposed, your hiding place compromised, your peaceful interlude ended. "What do you want?" you asked, though you already knew the answer. "You," Odysseus said simply. "The Greek army has gathered at Aulis, 1,000 ships waiting for favorable winds. We have the greatest heroes of our generation, the finest warriors from every kingdom. But we don't have you, and everyone knows we need you if we're going to take Troy." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Your mother was right to hide you. This war will be like nothing the world has ever seen. It will consume heroes like fire consumes kindling. Many of us won't survive it. Then why should I go?" Odysseus looked at you with something that might have been pity. "Because you're Achilles, son of Thetis. You were born for this war, trained for it, shaped by the fates themselves to be its greatest hero. You can hide from many things, but you can't hide from what you are." He gestured toward Deidomir and your son. "You've found happiness here, and that's precious, but it's not your story. Your story is written in bronze and blood, in songs that will outlast the stones of Troy itself. You know this. You did know it. Standing there in your ruined disguise, holding a sword that felt like coming home, you could feel destiny reasserting itself like a tide. The prophecy that had haunted your childhood was calling in its death. But looking at Neoptolemus in Deidamir's arms, you understood now what you'd be sacrificing. Not just your life, but this life. The quiet mornings, the domestic peace, the chance to see your son grow up. The prophecy was calling in its debt, demanding you choose between the love you'd found and the glory you'd been promised. "I need time to think," you said. Odysseus nodded as if he'd expected this. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be here for 3 days, enjoying King Lycomedes' hospitality. After that," he shrugged, "well, the war won't wait forever." He began packing up his wares, leaving only the sword on the table. "Consider that a gift," he said, nodding toward the blade. "Every hero needs a proper weapon, and I have a feeling you'll be needing yours soon." That evening, you sat with Deidomir on the cliffs overlooking the sea, your son asleep in her arms. The conversation you needed to have stretched between you like a chasm neither wanted to cross. "You're going, aren't you?" she said finally. You wanted to lie, to promise her that love was stronger than fate, that you'd choose family over glory, but she deserved honesty. "Yes." She nodded as if confirming something she'd already known. "When?" "Tomorrow, probably. Maybe the day after." You paused, searching for words that could bridge the distance between duty and desire. I don't want to leave you, either of you, but you have to. Yes. Deiodamia was quiet for a long time, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, despite the tears on her cheeks. Promise me something. Anything. Come back to us. I know what the prophecy says. I know what everyone expects. But prophecies aren't always literal. Fate isn't always fixed. You defied expectations once, when your mother tried to make you invulnerable. Maybe you can defy them again. You wanted to promise her everything, to swear oaths that would bind fate itself, but you'd learned enough about prophecy to know that some things couldn't be wished away. I'll try, you said, and hoped it was enough. It wasn't, of course, but it was all you could give her, and she accepted it the way she'd accepted everything else about your impossible situation, with grace and strength, and a love that made leaving feel like cutting out your own heart. Because nothing says perfect disguise like falling so deeply in love that revealing yourself becomes inevitable. You left Skyros on a morning when the sea was the colour of polished bronze and the wind carried omens in every gust. Your departure was private, witnessed only by those who mattered, Deiodamia, your son, and King Lycomedes, who looked relieved to see the last of his dangerous houseguest. Deiodamia didn't cry, which you found both admirable and heartbreaking. She held Neoptolemus with the fierce protectiveness of someone who knew she'd be raising him alone, at least for now. When you kissed her goodbye, it felt like sealing a contract with grief. "Remember what you promised," she whispered against your ear. "I will." But even as you said it, you could feel the weight of prophecy settling around your shoulders like familiar armour. The short life, the glorious death. They'd been waiting patiently while you played at domestic happiness. Now they were collecting their due. Odysseus watched your farewell with the polite distance of someone who understood that some moments were too private for observation. When you finally joined him on his ship, he simply nodded and gave orders to cast off. He'd gotten what he came for. Everything else was just human sentiment. The voyage to Aulis gave you time to transform back into what you'd been before Skyros. You discarded the last remnants of your feminine disguise, trading soft fabrics for leather and bronze. You braided your hair in the warrior's knot you'd worn as a child, strapped your sword across your back, and tried to remember how to be Achilles instead of Pyrrha, hero instead of father. But the months on Skyros had changed you in ways that went deeper than clothing or hairstyle. You'd learned things about yourself that couldn't be unlearned, that you were capable of gentleness, that love could make you vulnerable, that there were things worth preserving as well as things worth destroying. These revelations felt dangerous as you sailed toward war. Vulnerability was a luxury heroes couldn't afford. Gentleness was a weakness enemies would exploit. Love was a hostage that fate could hold against you. Yet you couldn't bring yourself to regret the time on Skyros, or the son you'd left behind, or the woman who'd seen through your disguise to the person beneath. Some experiences were worth their consequences, no matter how painful those consequences might be. Aulis appeared on the horizon like a forest of masts and sails. The gathered Greek fleet was massive beyond anything you'd imagined. 1,000 ships riding at anchor, their bronze-reinforced prows gleaming in the afternoon sun. Banners flew from every vessel, displaying the symbols of kingdoms and heroes whose names were already legend. This was what you'd been born for, this gathering of power, this convergence of ambition and glory and the terrible momentum of war. Every ship represented stories you'd heard since childhood, warriors whose deeds were sung by bards throughout the Greek world. But seeing it all assembled, you realized something that the stories never quite conveyed, the sheer scale of what they were attempting. Troy wasn't just a city, it was the greatest fortress in the known world, protected by walls built by gods, and defended by heroes as legendary as any in the Greek camp. What lay ahead wasn't just a war, it was a civilizational clash that would reshape the world. Your arrival caused the kind of stir you'd expected. Word spread quickly through the camp. Achilles had come, the son of Thetis, the greatest warrior of his generation. Men stopped their work to stare as you passed. Conversations died mid-sentence, then resumed in urgent whispers. You'd become a symbol before you'd even drawn your sword. Agamemnon, the High King leading this expedition, received you in his command tent with the forced warmth of someone greeting a valuable but dangerous ally. He was older than you'd expected, grey-bearded and thick around the middle, with the soft look of someone who'd spent more time commanding than fighting. "Achilles," he said, rising from his camp chair. "At last, we've been waiting for you." "So I gathered." You kept your voice neutral, taking the measure of the man who claimed authority over this massive undertaking. Power radiated from him, but it was political power, the kind that came from alliances and obligations rather than personal strength. "Your reputation precedes you," Agamemnon continued, gesturing for you to sit. "They say you're invincible in battle, that no weapon can harm you. Methinks you remain standing." You remain standing, a subtle assertion of independence that wasn't lost on the king. Not all of them true. Agamemnon's smile faltered slightly. He'd clearly expected more deference from someone your age. "Well, we'll have opportunity to test these stories soon enough. Troy awaits, and our seers promise favourable winds within the week." The meeting continued with discussions of logistics, strategy, the division of spoils after victory. You listened with half your attention while studying the other commanders present. These were the men you'd be fighting alongside: clever Odysseus, massive Ajax, proud Diomedes, dozens of others whose names carried weight throughout the Greek world. They studied you in return, measuring, calculating, wondering if you'd live up to the legends. Some looked hopeful. They needed a champion, a symbol around which to rally their forces. Others looked wary, recognizing that heroes could be as dangerous to their own side as to their enemies. After the formal meeting, you walked through the camp to get a sense of the army you'd joined. It was vast, diverse, representing every kingdom and city-state that had sworn allegiance to the expedition. Spartans drilled with mechanical precision, Athenians debated strategy in philosophical terms, islanders sang sea chanties while mending nets. But beneath the surface differences you sensed a common thread: anticipation mixed with dread. These men knew they were embarking on something unprecedented. Many would never see home again. The lucky ones would die gloriously, the unlucky ones would simply die. Your own troops were waiting when you returned to your assigned section of the beach. 50 Myrmidons, elite warriors from your father's kingdom, hand-picked for their loyalty and skill. They looked at you with the devotion of men who'd been told their commander was touched by divinity. Their captain, Patroclus, stepped forward to greet you. He was close to your own age, dark-haired and lean, with intelligent eyes and the kind of smile that suggested he found humour in unexpected places. Something about him felt familiar, though you were certain you'd never met. "Lord Achilles," he said, offering a salute that managed to be respectful without being servile. "Your Myrmidons await your orders." You returned the salute, studying this man who would apparently be your closest companion in the war to come. There was competence in his bearing, strength in his frame, but also something gentler, a quality that reminded you, painfully, of your time on Syros. "Just Achilles," you said. "We'll be fighting together. Formality will only get in the way." Patroclus nodded, and his smile widened. "In that case, welcome to the war, Achilles. We've been wondering when you'd join us. I'm here now." "Don't worry," he gestured toward the sprawling camp around you. "What do you think of our glorious expedition?" You considered the question seriously. What did you think? 1,000 ships filled with men eager for glory and wealth, gathered to assault the greatest fortress in the world. The prophecy that had shaped your entire life finally calling in its debt. Your son growing up without a father. Your lover facing an uncertain future, alone. "I think," you said finally, "that we're all about to discover who we really are." That night you stood alone on the beach, staring out at the dark water that separated you from home. Behind you, the camp settled into the routines of military life. Guards walking their posts, late conversations around dying fires, the sounds of men trying to sleep while contemplating their mortality. Tomorrow would bring training, planning, the 1,000 small preparations that preceded great undertakings. Soon, the winds would turn favourable and the fleet would sail. You'd see Troy's walls, meet its defenders, begin the war that would define you. But tonight was still yours. Tonight you could still imagine other futures, ones where you'd remained hidden on Syros, raised your son, grown old in peaceful obscurity. They were beautiful dreams, impossible dreams, dreams that belonged to someone who wasn't the son of Thetis. You touched the sword at your side, the blade Odysseus had used to reveal your true nature. It was a perfect weapon, balanced and keen, waiting to write your name in the annals of legend. Everything you were, everything you'd been trained to become, reduced to steel and edge and the will to use them. The wind shifted, carrying salt spray and the promise of morning. Somewhere across the dark water, Troy waited, ancient, proud, formidable. Your destiny lay within its walls, written in bronze and blood, and the songs that would outlast both. You were Achilles, son of Thetis, student of Chiron, father of Neoptolemus. You were the greatest warrior of your generation, the hero the poets would sing about until the end of time. You were 20 years old, invulnerable except for one small spot on your heel, and about to embark on the war that would test everything you'd learned. The calm before the storm stretched out around you like held breath. Soon enough, the war would begin. But that, as they say, is another story entirely. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Achilles' formative years, where divine parenting meets teenage rebellion and somehow produces history's most famous warrior. Sweet dreams, and remember, sometimes the greatest heroes are just people trying very hard not to become heroes.